So I'd like to get more active on this channel. I'm not sure where to start. This channel is my one channel that can be political, but it's also about actions that we can take instead of just talking about politics. But I think having an understanding of where you stand, what you believe, and why you believe it is important. To me, rational thought should be a guiding factor, the primary guiding factor in what you believe. Obviously, we live in a mysterious world. There's a lot of religious and philosophical thought about origins and how do we get here and where are we going and what is the role of the supernatural and God and all of that. I think that's exists. It's relevant. It's legitimate. But when thinking about, how do we relate to other people and how do we relate to the world and what do we believe politically, I really think that there should be some rationality to that thought. And that is not incompatible with the idea that there is a God or any other aspect of religion, especially what we call Western religion or Judeo-Christian thought or anything like that, because the whole concept there is that the God who created the world is rational and brought things into a sort of order and of reason that is not random. And that's the whole basis for belief in God, is that things are not random. They're not superstitious. There is a higher power. There is all that, but this whole system that we're in is guided by rational thought. It's intentional, and there are standards that you can apply. There's universal truths that you can apply. All religions, although it's expressed best, some have argued in Christianity, have some version of the golden rule. The golden rule is just a way of being consistent, of testing your own beliefs for consistency. It's also, I mean, a lot of people think of it as a rule about kindness that's primarily focused on kindness, treating other people well. It's the rule is about how you treat other people. But ultimately, bottom line is the rule is guided by the concept of consistency. And I would say of not having double standards. Double standards equal bad in all religious thought and all logical and rational thought. And single standard equals good. You apply the same standard to all people. If you wouldn't like it if they do it, we can't like it if they do it either, or if I do it. If I want to be treated this way, I need to treat all other people this way, etc. So if you have a problem with the golden rule, just so you know, you have a problem with all religions and you have a problem with rational thought, because the golden rule is just a way of testing for a double standard. And the lack of double standards is kind of the basis of rational thought. If you can just make exceptions wherever you want, then there is no basis for rational thought. Rational thought assumes that there is consistency. So, anyways, I wanted to get that out of the way. I'm pretty impressed that I did it in 3.5 minutes. Now, I'd like to pull up videos by someone I've never listened to until 2 days ago when I listened to the first 20 minutes of his interview with Tucker Carlson. And that is, of course, Nick Fuentes. Not sure how to pronounce his name, so I'm going to pronounce it the way that I assume. Since I don't want to make any assumptions, I'm going to move on here because what I was about to do was make a joke that would imply an assumption. I think it's careful. You have to be careful about joking when you don't know your audience and your audience doesn't know you. I don't think many of you know me. So if I make a joke, there's the risk that it's taken seriously. I think humor is good. It's important. But until you know your audience and your audience knows you, it's also kind of dangerous. So I'm going to pull up at random something by Nick Fuentes that is not that interview. So far, I'm 20 minutes into it. I want to do a video on it, but that's going to take a lot longer than I have storage left on my phone for. And it's also probably going to be live streamed, and I'm waiting because, again, this is a channel that I'm not that active on. I'm waiting for that live stream option to become available, which it should be in 24 hours. So right now, just Nick Fuentes or however you pronounce his name, and I'm just going to hit search, and we're going to see what comes up, and I'm going to watch something at random. That's sponsored. Now, I'm getting a bunch of stuff that aren't actually him talking. We have Nick Fuentes reveals his take on Charlie Kirk's final days and assassination. That's very specific. What I want to hear right now is, I've heard Nick Fuentes being accused of being a white nationalist slash being a racist many times, but I've never heard someone actually pull a specific quote from him that proves that or even points to it. Now, I heard a couple things in those first 20 minutes of the interview with Tucker Carlson. I heard a couple things that sounded a little bit racist, but he also didn't dive deep enough in them to really explain them. And I'm always up to hear, what is your rational thought behind this? And if there isn't any, if it sounds like racism and there isn't a rational defense for it, then it sounds even more like racism. But there's this Nick Fuentes crashes out on Tucker after softball interview. Doing this for America. The most canceled man in America, the truth about Nick Fuentes. Nick Fuentes is not the problem. They're overweight, entitled, and liberal. Nick Fuentes goes off on modern women. 14 minutes. I bet, now my take, where I think I'm coming from, is kind of a neutral standpoint. I try to be neutral. I think it's important to be neutral. And G.K. Chesterton said a quote that's kind of relevant to this. It was, an open mind has the same purpose as an open mouth, to close on something good. All right, the purpose of an open mind is not to always be neutral at all costs all the time. It's to hear both sides of an argument, hear both sides of an opinion or a perspective, and to be able to give a fair consideration to both sides. And then if one side is better than the other, you can go ahead and say that. You don't have to remain neutral at all costs, like I said. But going into the next debate, you do your best to put away those assumptions, because that was just one conversation. Maybe there's a point that conversation missed that should be willing to hear. And that's kind of the point of going into everything as neutral as possible. So I'm going to come into this interview as neutral as I can be, and be on the lookout for BS, but also be on the lookout for honest points. And I try to be discerning when I listen to something. I try to use logical thought. So let's listen to it, and let's see. I'll pause it when I want to, because I am, after all, the one making this video.
Why does Grandma's tummy look pregnant? This blocks your bowels.
Let's skip that.
Why aren't people married? Well, I mean, honestly, it's the women. The women are extremely liberal. No one talks about that. Increasingly they do, especially after the last election. There's a 45-point difference between men and women. The men are extreme.
Okay. Interesting. Already 18 seconds in, and this is from that Tucker Carlson interview, so I guess we're going to get piece by piece, but we're listening to Nick talking. It's the women. Now, hard to stay neutral on that, because you're a man talking. It's easy to be biased, very easy to be biased as a man, very easy to point blame elsewhere. Why am I not married? The women, but also me. And I'm aware of that. And this is a channel on which I might be a little more open personally, but I've been married. I got married when I was 21 years old, just shy of 22. She was 22. Did she bring some problems to the table? Yeah, she did. Did I? Yes, I did. And I think it's very, very likely that someone who immediately says it's the women, like, are you looking in the mirror? I don't believe you. My first impulse is I don't believe you, but I'm going to hear you out, because that's me trying to come in with a neutral viewpoint. But also my neutral viewpoint compounded with my personal experience, tells me that it's really easy to not look in the mirror and look at the other party in a situation. Now, he said they're liberal, they're overwhelmingly liberal. That's a true statement. The point difference that he's talking about, I think that's accurate. Maybe it's, a few points off one way or the other, but by and large, yes, women tend to be more liberal politically than men by, by the way that we measure that nowadays, and the things that we think are liberal and the things that we think are conservative. So that's true, but that's not immediately a fault. I'm not giving him much of a chance to talk here, so I'll keep listening. But this is not a fault yet. The fact that women, by and large, have a different opinion than men, by and large, the fact that there's a political disagreement between the two does not make it the woman's fault, nor does it make it the man's fault. It sounds to me like we have different perspectives, and we could ask each other, why is that? What led you to have the perspective you had, and what led me to have the perspective I have, and let's talk about that. Not, well, you're the problem because your political viewpoint is different than mine. So anyways, let's keep watching. Sorry. I'll try to let him go a little longer this time.
Conservative, increasingly. The women are extremely liberal.
What are they liberal on? What issues? Like, what does that mean, liberal?
Oh, they're very feminist.
Like, actually?
Extremely feminist,
I
yes.
don't believe that, do they?
Okay, we're getting definitions here. That's good. We're getting specifics. That's good. You need to define feminism. Feminism at one point in time was defined as, quote, the radical belief that women are humans too, or people too, something like that. That was obviously in the very early days of what was called feminism. Sometimes I think that putting an ism on the back of anything is just super bad idea, because it becomes this political thing that we argue about. Just put the ideas out there. Argue the ideas themselves. Do women deserve to be treated with equal respect as men? Let's argue that idea. Don't call it feminism or some other ism. Just say that's the idea that I believe in, and we can argue that directly. So, Nick, what do you, and maybe you'll answer this, what do you think feminism is?
I think they do.
Really?
Absolutely,
How could
yes.
you believe that?
I
That
think
gender roles are a construct, that none of this is inborn? Like, you'd have to be an idiot to think that.
they like the idea of it. They like because, of course, I think all women naturally want strong men.
Of course,
They
obviously.
naturally want a Chad. They
Yeah.
want like a tall, buff guy. But I think they like the idea of, none of them want to work either. None of them
That's what
actually
I'm
want
saying.
to work.
No, that's what I'm saying. Of course, that's
Right.
It's obviously true. It's always been true. Work outside the home.
Right.
They don't have enough work at home. There's
Yes.
a lot to do. But no, I completely agree. So that's why I question, like, their feminists in what sense?
Yes. And, they like these vague appeals to equality. We want a chance to work, and we want respect. And, ultimately, I think the whole political system is just based around women never being accountable for any of their choices. Ultimately, that seems to be that's what abortion is,
Yeah, of course.
as 99% of abortions are elective. So they say it's an unplanned pregnancy. You had sex out of wedlock with someone you didn't intend to have kids with. So now we have to kill the kids in the womb. And, these no-fault divorce laws. These women get married to guys maybe they never intend to stay with. And then when they're out, they're done. And they want child support, and they want half the stuff. And I think a lot of men are looking at women, and they're very liberal. They're overweight. They have a very high estimation of themselves. I think that people call it hoflation.
Inflation?
Yes, their sense of their own looks and sexual value is very inflated. And so a lot of people are looking at.
Okay, I'm gonna lose track of the things to address here. One thing I'm noticing is that Nick is very to the point, right? So if you want to engage with him, either it has to be very question based, as Tucker is being right now, and he's chiming in only when he agrees. Has he disagreed at any point so far? I'm not sure, because he's only spoken up to say, yeah, I agree with that. We can gather what his belief about what feminism means from what they said. So they're taking feminism to mean um, a complete lack of gender roles. And then the argument against that, of course, is that gender roles, now this is where it gets interesting. Gender roles exist, and they exist in nature, they exist in the natural world, therefore they exist for humans. That they've barely skimmed over that, but that actually is kind of the basis, because right, that's the foundational basis of where this whole argument stems from, especially for conservatives. Now, a liberal could maybe skim over that because they're not basing their viewpoint on that, but a conservative, specifically who's arguing what Nick Fuentes is arguing, is basing their entire viewpoint about feminism on the fact that or the assertion that gender roles exist in the natural world, and that informs us that they should exist for humans. I don't know if you caught that from what he said, but could play it back, and this, you could find this one. Play that back, and you'll hear that's what they say, basically. And I have a little bit of familiarity with that argument too, so I know.
That seems to be that's what abortion is.
Yeah, of course.
It's 99%. But I think they like the idea of, none of them want to work either. None of them.
Even further back.
Extremely feminist, yes.
They don't believe that, do they?
I think they do.
Really?
Absolutely,
Here we go.
yes.
I believe that.
I
That
think
gender roles are a construct, that none of this is inborn.
See, gender roles are a construct. And he's saying they can't possibly believe that gender roles are a construct. So that is not inborn. In other words, he firmly believes that it is inborn. It is ingrained in human nature to be drawn to specific gender roles. And that feminism's underlying mistake is to eliminate those gender roles. I want to say that I think this is something that's very easy for either side to just be like, the other side is ridiculous about on this issue. Like, obviously women should be treated with equality, and therefore anything a conservative has to say about their perspective is invalid. Or obviously gender roles exist and are ingrained, therefore anything a liberal has to say about this issue is completely invalid. Like, that's kind of where I hear people coming from. You're strongly one side or the other, and the piece of the truth that you are seeing is so front and center that you can't see around it to see any other argument that has validity in any way. There are gender roles in the natural world. And I mean, you can go through emperor penguins to lions to like literally almost any mammal or bird or what we would consider relatively developed animals. I'm not sure, I can't speak to insects or things like that. Actually, you can, because obviously in certain insect species, at least, like bees have a queen, and then a ton of males whose sole purpose in life is to protect the queen at all costs. And then there's like this weird, every other female bee is subservient in some way. I really don't quote me too much because I don't know much about it, but we've all heard of those kind of gender roles, even in the insect world. So do they exist in nature? Yes. Now, what is a human's relation to nature? That's a really valid philosophical and spiritual question. I'm not thinking of the word that I want there, the philosophy of religion. Are humans constrained to the same realities that what you might call lesser animals? I mean, I'm going to get myself in trouble no matter what terminology I use, and I think that's something I can take away from Nick. And it's something I believe in general, is that if you are trying to speak honestly. You should not get nitpicked about the specific words that you choose to use. And if someone has a problem with them, they could speak up. They could say, hey, I find that offensive for this reason. And then you can say, okay, well, I didn't mean it offensively. I just meant, that's just how I'm trying to use the language that we have to explain the position that I hold. And I don't think we always have to eliminate terminology from our language just because somebody is offended by it. Because, I mean, at the same time, I don't think that we should intentionally say things just to offend someone. There's a big difference, really big difference there. Being honest to yourself, being true to yourself, saying what you believe honestly and respectfully is very different than purposely using the most offensive language possible just to rile somebody up. And every reasonable person knows that difference. And there's people on I usually think of the center as usually where people are reasonable. The problem with the center is that a lot of times people in the center don't really know why they stand where they stand. And so they're easily herded around by people who are more at the extremes. But people on one extreme, are like, F your feelings. And people on the other extreme are like, you have to, accommodate anything I think or believe all the time. Look, my videos are not directed at trying to gain support from what I consider to be either extreme. Reasonable people can have conversations, and whether you express everything perfectly or not, we understand that you're kind of doing your best, and we can have this honest, genuine, legitimate conversation, and we don't have to freak out about stuff like that. So whether you consider humans animals or not consider humans animals, interesting thing is that if you're religious, specifically Christian, you might be less likely to consider humans animals, because that's like a scientific classification. And depending on where you stand theologically or in your belief set, you might not believe that science is adequate or correct there. But that's what makes it ironic, kind of, for conservatives who tend to be more likely to be Christian, to kind of say, well, look at the animal kingdom. And he didn't specifically say that. I just know that it's that thought process is kind of behind what he's saying. But so let's not spend more time there. Let's jump to what he actually said, which is that these women, ridiculously, in his opinion, don't believe that gender roles are inborn or ingrained. And therefore, he believes that they are ingrained in humans, regardless of what happens in the animal kingdom. I kind of put those words in his mouth, so that's my fault. I think that if I watched enough videos with either of these guys holding that perspective, they'd probably pull that argument in, but they didn't in this case. So I need to focus on the argument they actually used. Is it ingrained? Is it ingrained to have gender roles? Well, I would ask this question. Does the human race change over time? Is there progression? Because that's a big part of Christian theology. And it's also a big part of observing the world, whether you're looking at that through a scientific lens or a historic lens or whatever. The belief that there is a progression in human history is important. It's actually important to most of the Christians I know to believe that there is a progression, and it's observable. And you can make arguments that history is kind of cyclical and everything else, and that's probably true in some ways. I like to think that it's spiraling upward. And whether you agree with that or not, it's a valid question to ask. Is there a progression in human history, in human thought, in human ways of being and of living and of relating to each other and to the world. I think that there is, personally. This is also a channel in which I'm going to try not to shy away from sharing my personal beliefs. So is there ingrained sense of gender roles? Is there an inborn belief in gender roles? I think it's very probable that there is. And that also comes from thousands of years of human experience in which there have been gender roles for one reason or another, and not all of them good reasons. And this is somewhat supportive of a conservative viewpoint, or at least where they're drawing their information from. The conservative will tell you men are typically physically stronger than women. And that's true. You can't make that not true just because you don't want to believe it. And I think most people, men, women, all recognize that that's true. And there are some women who are stronger than some men. That's also very true. But as a category, men are typically physically stronger when it comes to just raw physical strength, being able to lift things, move things, measure with weights. They're stronger. There is a false equation to might makes right. To if you are stronger, you get to tell people who aren't as physically strong what to do. And this has led to the two negative stereotypes, one that applies to men, one that applies to women. Negative stereotype of men is that they're going to bully their way through things, including with their partners, whether it's actually domestic abuse and violence, or whether it's just being loud and intimidating, which some would consider abuse or violence as well. Or whether it's just bringing this attitude towards the table that whatever I say is going to go and I expect that. Maybe never raising your voice. This is something I struggled with in my own marriage. It's a little more complicated than that, because it was somewhat ingrained in me, despite being theoretically progressive and liberal. That's not to say that there wasn't some of that displayed in my own family that I witnessed growing up. Both my parents are wonderful people and did their best and do their best to live out their values every single day. But they're also coming out of a generation where there was even more of that. And obviously you take some of that with you. No matter what you say you believe about it, you take some of what you experienced with you and you try to overcome it if you think you should, or you try to uphold it if you think you should. But either way, you do bring some with you subconsciously. And so that begs a really legitimate question. How much of this is subconscious, based on what we have experienced and witnessed from a very young age, and how much of it is actually ingrained or inborn, and how do you tell the difference? Because either way, by the time you're 10 years old, it's going to look the same. But it has different implications. Inborn, born with it, means it gives it a little more air of legitimacy. Like if you're born with something, it makes it sound a little more legitimate than you learned it within the first 10 years of your life by observing the behaviors of those around you. I think it's a legitimate question to ask, and I think it's one that they're not asking or even thinking to ask necessarily. And it does bear weight on this discussion. I've had some Facebook debates with people recently, and in the particular context, sometimes I argue for what is considered to be the conservative side of an issue, and sometimes I get well, whatever, I don't care response, which doesn't happen as much, and I don't think it happens as much. I'd really have to go back and look over every single argument I ever had on Facebook to say this definitively. But what I will say definitively, because it's very memorable, because it's very recent, is that I posted something that was mainly critical on what was definitely a Facebook post targeted at conservatives, trying to get favor from conservatives. And I had a lot of conservatives say, like, your point's invalid because such and such. Specifically, I asked whether Jesus would wave bacon in the face of somebody who's praying, and I said I don't think he would. And then someone said, well, these guys who did that never claimed to be Christian or representing Jesus or whatever. And I said, well, look at the shirt of the first guy. It says Jesus is God on the shirt. So I think he did bring Jesus into this situation. He did make a statement through what he was wearing about whose name he was doing this in. I'm not saying everybody who believes in Jesus or worships Jesus or is Christian would do this. I don't think that. But in this case, it was plastered all over his shirt that, this is where he's coming from. And the guy said, and blah, blah, blah. Long story short, he's just like, whatever. I thought you were part of the party that believes in rational debate, right? That believes in rational thought, that believes that everything you believe should come out of rational thought. That's kind of been the big conservative sounding that's been the big conservative thing lately. I noticed that ever since Charlie Kirk was killed, and all of a sudden there were so many people saying he was just committed to rational thought and rational argument and everything else. And I'm not saying he wasn't. I think he was, actually. And I think that he was becoming increasingly committed to rational thought and having integrity to where that took him, even if it was in opposition to his donors, to people who supported him financially. I see him as somebody who did have a great deal of personal integrity, even when it wasn't convenient to him. So I think he set a great example there. I'm not saying he wasn't ever racist or whatever, and I have a different video where I kind of explain that. I'm not saying he always came to the right conclusions or anything like that, but I do think that he was an individual who was very committed to rational thought. And then so you have a whole bunch of conservatives claiming to follow in those footsteps. And I say claiming because it's unfortunately true that in a number of these kind of debates that I've initiated with people recently, people give up when it comes to the point of being asked to confront a reality. And then they pull the I don't care card. Look, you can't just care until you're losing and then you don't care. It's okay to admit that you were wrong, you had missed something, you hadn't thought of something. I do that all the time. But that's the double standard thing, right? The test is whether there's a double standard. If everything's all about rational thought until rational thought isn't working to win your position, then you can't stand on the grounds of being all about rational thought. Or you need to provide some pretty specific justification about why it doesn't apply in this situation. Well, I believe in this spiritual reality that you cannot defend rationally. It's kind of hard to tackle that one. You kind of just have to say, okay, so you believe in that spiritual, you believe that this is the spiritual reality and you can't make a rational statement about it. Okay. at least you're telling us what it is. And at least we can say, like, okay, I kind of want to do that too, or no, that's not the path I want to go down. But don't pretend that you arrived at it with rational thought if that's not how you got there. Double standards, consistency, I think they're important. Now, where were we about the feminist movement? Again, it depends on how you define it, and it also depends on how you think about this whole process. And I don't think it's a given. Like Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson are assuming it's a given that gender roles are inborn. Now, let me qualify that a little bit. Men and women are different from each other. And I think that there's some on the far left who might be off put by me saying that. Maybe. You tell me if you feel that you're over there politically. Men and women are different. We are physiologically different. I do think that some of the innate desires of a man are different than the innate inborn, desires of a woman. Should that inform political policy or political opinions and viewpoints? I'm not sure. But here, let me put it positively. Let me put my beliefs positively, which is something that Tucker seems to be kind of pushing Nick to do, which I appreciate. My belief is that two people who are together should find a way of existing that is mutually beneficial to them and that respects each other's desires and hopes for what life will be. And sometimes when somebody feels conflicted about what their desires are, which my ex-wife did, and there's no reason to make any excuses or beat around the bush about that. She felt conflicted because she wanted to be in charge of certain things. But she also wanted me to be the leader and the, quote, man because of her religious beliefs. I actually feel very sad for her about that. And for me, too, being caught in that situation. Because I'm like, I don't really care if you want to make some decisions about a certain thing. Like, we did a road trip. Went back when we were dating. We did a road trip together. And she kept telling me, like, make sure you do this, make sure you do that. And then she kept apologizing she was like, wanted me to decide the route in a certain way. She wanted to make sure we took a bunch of back roads. That's all it was. Great. I love that. I want that too. This doesn't need to be some sort of argument or some sort of like weird guilt inducing thing to want and to tell me that you want. We're humans. Okay, we're humans. First and foremost, before everything else, yes, I think we want to relate to each other as male and female. I think that there are certain things that men want in women and that women want in men, and that's all okay. But first and foremost, we are humans. We want a relationship with another human being who has opinions and perspectives. And when it gets to the point of like a woman thinking that she's not allowed or shouldn't have her opinions or perspectives about something and shouldn't be allowed to share them out of some idea that it's the man's job to come up with this all on his own and be the leader, I think it becomes really toxic really fast. That's all I'm saying. And I think what people who are on an extreme tend to do is be drawn magnetically to the opposite, right? Opposites attract. And so if someone who's kind of extreme on the right is referring to what they think of as, the quote democratic or liberal, and liberal is the dirtier word of the two for conservatives, as I guess, interestingly enough, Republican is probably the dirtier word of the two for liberals. But they, being extreme, you tend to point fingers at the other extreme because that's what you're balancing out. That's what you're counterweighting. And so I think he's kind of pointing at a relatively extreme version of what you would call feminism or liberal thought. And I'm not saying that there isn't a demographic and a growing demographic that actually kind of is there. But yeah. Then he said something about it's all about zero accountability for women. Men have and have always had mechanisms for avoiding responsibility for the decisions that we make. Men have always had that. So this goes back to like, you have legitimate criticisms of versions of feminism, at least. Again, I'm not willing to throw all feminism, all of what anyone might ever label feminism, under this one little umbrella of what he's talking about and describing it as. But he's having some legitimate criticisms of certain things that fall under what you could call feminism. However, this goes back, the big umbrella here is that women are worse than men. His words, not mine. Don't pull that out of context and use it against me when I run for office in a future election cycle. But that's problematic because pointing out that there's problems with someone else is not the same as convincing me that there aren't the same problems with you or with the category that you aren't talking about. It's really easy to just direct everyone's attention over there. And therefore we never even think to ask, well, what's going on over here, right? Do we really think that men consistently take more responsibility for their decisions than women do? Pregnancy as an example. No one's going to miss the fact that the woman had sex out of wedlock if they can see that she's visibly pregnant and not married. Everybody can miss the fact that a man, a specific man, who is going to go unnamed and unknown unless she names him, also did. Right? So it's really easy to see what woman did. It's not easy to see what man did, but I promise you, for every woman who got pregnant, there is one man at a 1-to-1 ratio. I promise you that. Fact check me. So what are those men doing? Are they taking responsibility? Or are they making a really convenient argument that they want to take responsibility? They would take responsibility if only the women weren't so terrible. Because there's very little risk that they actually have to. And yes, I do find it problematic that courts tend to decide a certain way in those cases. There should be opportunity for any man who's paying child support. There should be opportunity in a situation where the two people are not together. he should have the opportunity to not pay child support and to spend half of the time with his children. That creates a really messy scenario. I mean, it's kind of messy the moment that two people who have separated have a child together. It's immediately messy for somebody, especially the child. Like that's the one who it's going to be messy for every single time. It's probably going to be messy for the man, the woman, or both as well. And that's really unfortunate. And I think that we should work on being able to reconcile with each other better. And the first thing that looks like is not saying, well, they suck. Right? That's the first step. And so I'm not convinced by Nick Fuentes here, because he's not taking the very first step in encouraging men, of which he is in that category, to do their part to avoid what is an inherently messy situation. So that's my criticism there. Now, if those two people are not able to reconcile, I absolutely think that the man should have the opportunity to not pay child support, as long as he is taking half of the responsibility for, the being present to raise his children, which many men want, and some might say they want, but they're not actually going to rise to the occasion when it happens. And that's a criticism that I've heard and I believe is a genuine criticism of men. Sometimes say they want to be with their kids, raise their kids, have time with their kids, but then the second they actually get that time, they're not using it to spend quality time with their kids. It's like, you fought for this. You said how much you wanted this, and then you had it, and what are you doing? You're watching TV and ignoring your children or your child. And that's, so I'm just kind of making the point. I hear the criticisms towards women. I do. Some of them are valid. They are. And at the same time, men, what are we doing? Are we spending our time criticizing, or are we spending our time being better? And I'm not saying that like men have this responsibility to be better than women. I'm saying that like men have a responsibility to be better than the worst version of ourselves. And I think that any responsible response to a question like, what's going on between men and women has some element of taking responsibility in it. And the response I heard from Nick was the opposite. It's the women. Let's be honest, it's the women. Are there legitimate complaints about the women? Yes, there are. But to open up that way shows it actually proves one of the legitimate complaints about men. Men not stepping up to some gender role or some expectation placed on them by a woman, but literally not stepping up to what they say they want in a human being. And that is taking responsibility. And again, that's the rule. Is there a double standard? If there is, there's a problem. We are all of 39 seconds into this video, and it's 14 minutes and 44 seconds long. So we got 14 minutes and 5 seconds left. We're not going to get there today. Thanks for watching this episode. It is my channel, so you're going to hear me talking more than I let anybody else talk here. That's the way it is, I guess. Hopefully I have something worth saying. And thank you for watching. I will catch you at a later time and date. That's all for now.